These valuable players have still not been signed to NBA teams. After NBA free agency started, most of the stars and really good players have already been signed. But even at this late stage of NBA free agency, there's still a ton of value out there for NBA teams. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy Sports, I make opinionative NBA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. I also want to quickly mention that I recently started up an MMA channel, and if you guys are interested in that, the link will be in the description. But anyways, let's get into it. NBA free agency is a very important part of NBA front offices. This is a time where you look to add players to improve your roster overall, and in an ideal world, you would look to add players that would help you or get you closer to winning an NBA championship. Basically, what you're looking to do is find value. And in this video, we're going to talk about a few different players that have a ton of value, but still haven't been signed to an NBA team yet for one reason or the other. And we're going to start with Collin Sexton. So ever since Collin was drafted, he was always seen as a pretty good player, and each and every season that he played ever since he got drafted, he improved this game, which is exactly what you want to see from your young player, especially your young point guard. Now, unfortunately, he did go down with an injury this previous season, which did keep him out for basically the entire year, but prior to this, as I mentioned, he was showing a ton of promise. And I certainly think a bunch of different teams could use a scoring threat like Collin Sexton. But in my opinion, I think there's a few different reasons for why he hasn't been signed as of yet. And probably the first reason is the fact that he was injured this previous year, and you typically see this with players that do get injured in their contract years. Teams just aren't willing to give out substantial contracts to players that are coming off major injuries due to the fact that they don't necessarily know how that player would look post-injury. So I definitely think that plays a major factor in why Collin hasn't been signed as of yet. But I think another reason for why Collin hasn't been signed as of yet is he is looking for a pretty substantial contract, and a contract that NBA teams are just not willing to match. Now, there's always a possibility that a team could come in last second and give Collin the money that he did want, but it seems like at this point it's pretty late into free agency, and he's probably not going to get that offer that he is looking for, at least at this point. But whenever Collin does end up getting signed by an NBA team, whether that ends up being the Cleveland Cavaliers or a different team, that team is going to get a phenomenal young player that would provide a phenomenal scoring threat. And something that I could see for Collin is maybe he would get a one-year prove-it type deal with the Cavaliers or another team, and if he does play well next year and he does stay relatively injury-free, he would then get a much bigger contract the season following. So the next player that I want to touch upon is Carmelo Anthony. So Melo, of course, has been a phenomenal player for a very long time now, but at this point, he's obviously not the same player that he was in the past. And at this point, I would say Melo is more so of a spot-up shooter that still definitely has the ability to score for himself at times. But obviously, he's no longer the player that could be the main guy on your team. But even though Melo isn't the player that he used to be, he still provides a ton of value for NBA teams. And if Melo were to sign with a championship contending team, he would provide a ton of value by just spreading the floor and giving a lot more room to their younger stars on their team, while also being a phenomenal veteran presence in the locker room to also help their younger guys as well, of course. But I think the reason why Melo hasn't been signed as of yet is he's just going to be one of those guys that sign a one-year relatively cheap contract, and he's probably just going to sign a contract with a team much later on in the free agency process. Now, the next player that I want to touch upon is DeMarcus Cousins. Now, DeMarcus is somewhat of a similar case to Carmelo Anthony in the sense that he's not necessarily as good as he used to be in his prime. But one thing that I will say is I think DeMarcus is a lot closer to his prime than Melo is. But at this point, even though DeMarcus isn't a superstar anymore, or at the very least a high-level all-star, he's still a guy that in certain games will flash back to his old ways and put up amazing performances. But even besides that, he's overall just going to be a pretty valuable player for your team, based on his ability to spread the floor very nicely and even run the pick and roll or pick and pop, or just dominate in the post in certain games, which he still obviously has a capability to do. And I could see DeMarcus signing with a championship contending team later later on in this free agency class as a backup center, and of course he would also be capable of being a starting level center if that team that he does end up signing with desperately needs a big man, or the big man that they have goes down with an injury. Now the next player that I want to touch upon is Montrezl Harrell. So ever since Montrezl Harrell left the Los Angeles Clippers, his value and his play on the court has never really been at the same level. In Los Angeles, he was putting up a really good 19-7 coming off the bench while also shooting a very good 58% from the field. And those numbers that he had put up for the Clippers, and even besides that, just the general play that he was putting up game in and game out, was just never really replicated ever since he left the Clippers. But still at this point, I would say he's a pretty valuable player coming off the bench for many teams in the league. He still has a really nice ability to score the basketball at that power forward or even center position if you want to play somewhat small. He definitely does most of his damage running the pick and roll offense, but at the same time, he could definitely create for himself in the post and even somewhat score for himself from that mid-range as well. He doesn't necessarily shoot the three ball well whatsoever, which is certainly a negative, especially in the new age NBA, but even though he doesn't have that three-point jump shot, I still do think he's a pretty valuable player in the NBA at this point. Now, I'm not necessarily sure which team Montrezl Harrell will sign with. Maybe he ends up just re-signing with the Hornets, but I really think he can go anywhere. I don't necessarily think there's one category of team that he would definitely sign with over another. Now, the last person that I want to touch upon is Dennis Schroder. So Dennis is a guy who's a very talented player and puts up pretty good numbers year in and year out, where he provides most of his value with his great scoring ability, but at the same time, he of course has a pretty nice ability to pass and play make and overall just facilitate for a team, which is always going to be valuable for anybody. And at this point, I see Schroder as a backup point guard for basically any really good team in the NBA, especially a championship contending one. But at the same time, Dennis doesn't necessarily fit in with every team, as not every player would, of course, and you would need Dennis to go to a specific team where he would fit in nicely. And I think that's probably one of the bigger reasons for why he hasn't been signed as of yet. But eventually, when he does get signed, assuming that he does, and he definitely should based upon his talent level, I think he'll probably sign a one-year deal on a relatively cheap contract once again, just like he did last year. And if he plays very well this upcoming season, then he could potentially get a bigger contract the following year. Now, I am very confident that every single player that I mentioned on this list will eventually sign with an NBA team, as they do provide a ton of value to teams, and I probably would say most of the players that I did mention in this video may sign a contract with a team later on in free agency, when either A, the contract that they wanted obviously will not come to fruition and they just end up signing a cheaper one-year deal with a team, or B, some of the options or some of the teams that that player wanted to go to doesn't necessarily come to fruition and they need to settle and go to a different team. But those are 5 valuable players that somehow still haven't been signed yet. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think these 5 players on the list should be signed by the end of free agency, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these 2 videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.